Okay, so I want to continue on from our discussion about different types of discrimination. Remember, I've talked about, at this point, blatant discrimination, subtle discrimination, and covert discrimination. And I want to move on to just briefly mention something that we've talked about at different points in the class that has something to do with all of these different types of discrimination, probably underlying both our intentional and unintentional ways that we might engage in discrimination against different groups. So if you think back to our units on social cognition and attitudes, we talked a whole lot about unconscious processes. And in the attitudes unit, we talked specifically about implicit attitudes, those unconscious associations that we have between different concepts and others, or between concepts and just the ideas about whether they're good or bad, right? I talked about the implicit association test, that computer response time test where you're just trying to, in the case of the race IAT, associate faces with the concepts of good and bad. And if you are someone that tends to associate the black faces with words that are bad faster than you do with words that are good, and you tend to associate white faces with words that are good faster than you do words that are bad, then that would indicate some level of implicit racial bias toward whites. So those types of tests can be very useful in trying to predict what types of discriminatory behaviors people might engage in. And there's tons and tons of evidence about this, truly enough that we could talk about it for an entire semester. So I, can't spend a whole ton of time talking about it because we have lots of other stuff to cover in this unit, and we've already kind of touched on it a little bit. But one that we've already touched on, even in this unit, is from the video that hopefully you watched, showing the black and white men going about their days and encountering different outcomes for the same types of activities. One study that I briefly mentioned was how black men were recommended to have a heart procedure less often than white men, even though the procedure was necessary. So the doctors were not informing their black patients about those heart procedures. Maybe not explicitly or intentionally. The study doesn't have a specific claim about that, but the outcomes were disparate, of course. But follow-up studies have shown that even fewer black patients are getting these types of recommendations if their doctors have more implicit bias against blacks. So even if doctors don't explicitly endorse negative racial stereotypes about black people, if they have a preference for whites implicitly, then they are less likely to be equitable in the way that they recommend those types of treatments. And there are tons of examples of these types of disparities in the health field too. Another study looked at just black patients' experiences with their doctors, and they had doctors take these IATs, and they got lots and lots of different outcomes from the patients and the doctors' experiences, and like more objective outcomes. And they found all these different relationships related to the doctor's implicit attitudes, that even when you controlled for the explicit attitudes of doctors, their implicit racial bias made them talk to black patients differently. They were more dominant. They spoke more slowly. The black patients did not feel as good in reflecting on the visits. The visits took longer. They didn't feel like they were getting as much positive focus as other patients did. And maybe most importantly, black patients were less trusting of their doctors and rated them more poorly. So because of the doctors, I guess making a causal claim is sort of tricky to do here, but at least related to doctors' implicit racial attitudes, Black patients are having worse experiences of the doctor and don't feel as though they can trust their doctors the more implicitly biased their doctors happen to be. So that's a real kind of scary problem there that needs to be addressed. But happily, many hospital systems and med schools are taking issues like this seriously, and implicit bias training is not like a cure-all for everything, but it might be an important first step to try to reduce some of these types of disparities. So like I said, we can't spend a whole ton of time talking about implicit bias because it is a pretty complex concept, especially when you get into the evidence behind it. There's a lot of math that you kind of have to get a handle on to figure out, what effects are reliable and what aren't. But implicit bias still has a lot of impacts on all sorts of things going on in our day-to-day lives that we might not always be aware of. And maybe more importantly, those things add up. They aggregate. So even if you have some issues with the evidence about implicit bias on an individual level, there's a lot of evidence that implicit bias on an aggregated or regional level is very highly related to discriminatory outcomes, like for aggregate health outcomes for minority populations, more police stops of African American people in areas where the county, for example, has more negative implicit attitudes toward blacks. So these things can aggregate. And when you're thinking about these different types of levels of analysis, it's important to think about how discrimination differs across different levels of analysis. So most of the stuff that comes to mind immediately when you think about discrimination might be more on the interpersonal level. It's easy to think about it mostly this way because it's kind of the most direct and obvious way you might think about this. Somebody intentionally not giving somebody a job, or making a racial epithet, or somebody getting pulled over specifically because they are black or something like that. So these specific individual behaviors that are directed at another individual tend to be very visible and obvious and be useful and clear examples of discrimination. But they're far, obviously, from the only types of discrimination that exist. Institutional discrimination, now we're kind of getting into some terms that maybe are a little bit more sociological in origin, but they're very useful to think about as we try to figure out what discrimination and prejudice are like across different social contexts. So institutional discrimination is when a particular social institution, like the criminal justice system, different aspects of government, school system, the types of messages and conduct in a church, things like this, when norms, practices, or policies of those institutions result in unequal outcomes for different groups. So, for example, the fact that African Americans tend to be convicted of crimes at a higher rate than other races and tend to get arrested more than other races per capita, even for crimes that we have evidence that are committed roughly at the same rate by all different races. These kind of inequitable outcomes that come out of the criminal justice system that don't really seem to have any basis in actual behavior from these different groups of people. So it's really important to not just think about things at a one-to-one, like person-to-person level, but these things aggregate up. The way that we treat different people in these interpersonal levels can add up into these institutional types of outcomes, and it also tends to be the case that maybe implicit bias kind of creeps into the way that we build our institutions, that we might not intentionally always have the idea that we want people that look differently than us are people from different places than us to not have a fair shake at things. But when we build institutions to prioritize our own needs, we might ignore the needs of other people and not think about them in an equitable way. So whether it's intentional or not, institutional discrimination is a very real thing that if we don't see it because we happen to be in a group that is not the target of it, then we might not be aware of it. So it's important to think about these things and try to see things from other groups' perspectives. Organizational discrimination, I have here just as kind of a specific instance of institutional discrimination. You might think about this as like, a company that has a discriminatory policy, or a specific religion like the Catholic Church or something, or the one aspect of the government perhaps has a problem with discrimination. So institutional discrimination in general is usually referring to things at a broader level. Organizational discrimination might be a specific instance of that. Sort of related but separate to institutional discrimination would be cultural discrimination. Another one that's kind of abstract but is maybe a little more obvious to people, that the different content of our culture can have prejudice and negative portrayals and inequality built into it. So the way that people from, let's say, different racial groups are portrayed in popular literature, film, books are literature, obviously, but different types of entertainment, if those things are inaccurate and focusing on negative, tokenized portrayals of people, then that is problematic, and that perpetuates the types of stereotypes that we have about people. Because remember, we get our attitudes and stereotypes about different groups, at least in part, from the things that we learn indirectly. And it can be, those things can make up, what comes to mind for you if you don't have much experience with a particular group. So if you, for example, don't have much exposure to Latinx people, and you just happen to see in movies stereotypical portrayals of people from those groups, then your understanding of what they're like and how you're going to treat people from those groups is going to be based on ignorance of direct experience with them, and focus mostly on those negative portrayals. And you might know that they're wrong, and you might have an intention not to act on them, but that is still going to inform your immediate sort of implicit reactions to them, which is of course problematic. So the things that we live in our everyday lives, and the way that we talk about different groups, I've talked about how stereotypes are reflected in language. That's another way that discrimination is built into our different cultural practices. So these things, like I said, even though they're a little more abstract, they might be a little more obvious than some of the institutional types of discrimination. One other kind of sociological distinction that I think is important to bring in here is that when all these things are added together, aggregated, some groups end up with advantages, and some groups that are discriminated against, whether through interpersonal, institutional, or cultural means, or more often a combination of all three, the inequities that we see in the world have specific names. That groups that have some kind of special advantage, immunity, permission, rights, or benefits granted to them, those are what we would call privileged groups. And groups that are kept down by some sort of unjust norms, use of force, or authority are groups that we would call oppressed. I know, you might have a reaction that these are very evocative terms that maybe you feel are kind of hyperbolic or something, but these are, I think, pretty accurate ways to describe the ways that some groups go through the world, that some groups have the freedom and privilege to, not be burdened by their group identities, and don't really have to think about it very much, and other groups have to constantly be navigating things about their identity and, just having to scrape by in some sense. And, there's a lot of pejorative ways that people talk about these terms. Sometimes people, talk about white privilege in a very dismissive way sometimes, but it is, like a very real thing. For example, I can't help but think of a really evocative example that I saw, or that, is in the news recently, that, there are those protests to reopen states, and, the extent to which those protests are real, or if they are kind of, being pushed on by different political organizations is another question, but those protests in large part are white individuals, and at least some of them in Michigan, the footage you see of them are people that are around state capitals, walking around with AK-47s and other big, imposing types of weaponry, and there is an implicit privilege there that those white individuals that are in a privileged group, they don't think about the fact that not everybody would have that right necessarily, or everyone, has the right, but not everyone would have the implied right from their privilege to walk around with an AK-47. If you were a person perhaps with a dark-colored skin that went to those types of protests, you would probably be more careful about that because you know about the different ways that your group is oppressed and has to think more about your actions because of how things are portrayed. So I know these are kind of tricky waters to wade into, but I do want to try to use examples that are current, and try to show how these things relate to real life. They're not just kind of words that come out of a social psych or sociology textbook. Like, they really do describe something about the way that people from different groups have to navigate the world. Okay. I want to move on to, actually, you know what, I'm going to cut this one off and then start talking about why people are prejudiced in the next video.